Hello and welcome to the Sci-Fi Show. I'm Joe.
And I'm Dave.
And as Lone Wolf has rightly said right at the beginning, 45 seconds until technical difficulties begin. Yes, that has been the case of pretty much every sci-fi show so far. We've had one technical difficulty after another. In fact, I even had some technical difficulties before the stream even started, where I was having a mix and I was testing out some new stuff because I wanted to start doing the pre-stream mixes, and the software kept crashing, hence not doing a mix today. So there you go. And hey Chris, how you doing? I'm glad you love Data. He was a great character. But of course, what sort of character was he? What sort of being was he? Well, he was an android. And what sort of OS does my phone run? Oh, that's also Android. Two different uses of the word android. And that's sort of what we're talking about today, isn't it, Dave?
It is. We're going all Wittgensteinian today. And we're talking about language games and context of this, words and how words can mean multiple things, and used in one context they mean one thing and in another context another thing, and how you can actually use words incorrectly, sort of.
Or at least at times.
Yeah, you can use them you can use the wrong definition in the wrong context, and that, as Wittgenstein says, you shouldn't mix up the language games because that's when communication falls apart.
So why does he call them a language game, Dave?
Okay. Because they kind of represent the rules of the game. It's part of how I'm going to, or part of what I'm going to talk about. But I sort of have to build up to why. But essentially, he says that when we use words, we exist in the same kind of context that we would exist in if we're playing a game, where I throw out a response, I throw something out, and just like if we were throwing a ball to each other, I throw something out to you and you throw back an appropriate response to me, and then I throw back an appropriate response, and that's how communication happens. And it happens within a set of certain rules where we agree that certain words mean certain things, and what we're talking about is going to be using these terms, that kind of thing.
That makes a lot of sense. I suppose when you think about any conversation, it is that sort of back and forth like a game. And as you're right, there are different rules depending on the context of the conversation. You know, we communicate differently when we're at work to how we might communicate with our friends to how we might communicate to meeting your partner's parents for the first time. And then there's obviously different situations where, you know, if your work is a specific job, you might be using language differently then, not just because you'll be behaving differently because you're at work, but because there might be specific words for this particular job that you're doing and how it and what it means to be in each one of these situations.
Exactly. And it's why I kind of used the pictures that I did in the title card, because in one you've got this is a table, and in the other you have this is a table, and both are two different kinds of tables. And it'd be wrong to say that's not a table, that's a periodic element, a list of periodic elements. Well, it's still a table in the right context. And somebody could say, well, that's not a table, that's a picture of a table. But within the actual language game there, we're expected to understand the rules that what's being discussed when I say this is a table isn't the picture, it's what the picture represents.
Yeah, it's the content of the picture. I think you expect people to be aware of you're discussing the picture. Of course it's a picture. Yeah, in fact, it's a digital representation.
Exactly, it's pixels on a screen.
Yeah.
All those things are true. But you're expecting to be situated in this particular language game where the people know that you're referring to the content of what it's describing rather than the actual thing it's describing. One popular example is a guy is selling a desk to somebody that they know. It's a good solid oak desk, and he knocks on it and he says to the friend, "This is
It's
a good
very
solid
woody.
desk." Yeah. And somebody comes in and says, "Well, wait a minute, that's not solid. All things are made up of mostly empty space. So it's not solid at all. It's mostly empty space." Now, both people are right, but one of them is playing the wrong language game.
Yep. Makes sense. The empty space has been arranged into a solid oak desk.
Exactly. It's, one speaking of maybe the more
macro
scientific.
scale.
Yeah,
macro scale to micro scale. Yeah.
They're using these kind of scientific terms, and they're not wrong, but the other guy's talking phenomenologically. This is what we experience. It's a nice, solid table.
Yeah, there's the whole. I mean, this is glass isn't fully full, half full, but it's someone will say the glass is half empty, someone will say it's half full, and someone else will go, it doesn't matter what's in it, it's still 99% empty space.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, like, yes, but for the context of what we're saying here,
we're discussing what's in the glass.
Yeah.
How much is it filled? Yep.
How it appears to us. And sure, if you want to change it to a specific conversation about the empty space, then yeah.
Go for it. But, there's other people that want to hold that conversation. Not the person selling the desk and not the person buying the desk. They don't want to know if it's mostly empty space. They want to know if it'll hold their desktop. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And this kind of brings us to another thing that is going to be discussed later, in that Wittgenstein says that there is no one language game to rule them all. So if we were to say, well, that person's right, the one talking about the empty space, because science describes reality as it is, and we should be using how science discusses stuff because science knows best, it gives us the best knowledge. But in that case, it wouldn't be giving us the best knowledge because it would be telling us the desk is mostly empty space. So it wouldn't be doing the job of what we need it to do. So we need a different language game for just discussing everyday phenomenon.
There's an interesting point just brought up in the chat by Chris. He says, this reminds me of the Star Trek episode where Picard has to communicate with a civilization that uses allegories and metaphors, and Picard had to figure out their history. Remember how hard it would be talk to a completely different group of people. Shakar, and the walls fell.
Yeah, Darmok.
Yeah, Darmok and Jalad, Tanagra.
Yeah.
Brilliant episode. I don't know how that would actually work, but...
Well, this is another reason that you can sort of refer to language games as a kind of game. If you think about a game analyst, somebody who analyzes football or pool or, esports, those kind of things, they can figure out the rules of a game from paying close enough attention to what's being played, how it's being played, what happens when certain things happen. And you can say the same for a language. Like you might not necessarily even have to be able to speak the language or understand it, but you could understand when somebody's communicating to somebody to go get something. You can understand when somebody's asking a question by the tone in voice changes and how things happen. And eventually, from understanding that language game, you can figure out how the communication happens. And that's sort of what Picard does in that episode. He looks at what the responses are, and even though he doesn't know the actual history, he begins to understand from analyzing how that game is played, how he can best respond.
Yeah, it's a great example of the game being played, really, isn't it?
It is. It's a really good example.
Yeah. So well done, Chris. Thank you for bringing that up.
Although I will say Chris isn't showing up in my chat.
He's speaking via Facebook, so messages come through,
Okay.
and it comes into the restream chat, which you should have access to actually, because I made you an admin on the thingy. But yeah, but it's okay.
Okay, so if you can just repeat his questions,
I will do. Any of them that come through, I'll let you know. But Chris, you can always join us on the old YouTube as well. Feel free. And then we can actually respond directly to you, because we can't actually respond to your messages on when you're on Facebook, because for some reason they're just a one-way thing. So sometimes it looks like at the end of it that you've written like 20 messages, and we we respond to you. But feel free to jump onto our YouTube and join us here.
Anything else?
No. I was just catching. Okay. Icarus says, if you fill it half, it's half full. If you fill it completely and drink half of it, it's half empty.
That's kind of true.
Yeah.
It's a sort of language game going on there.
Yeah. There's a good Bill Bailey sketch on this. He goes, does it matter what the liquid is? What if it's blood?
Yeah.
But yes, no, I'd agree with you there, Icarus. And obviously you've sort of filled in one particular way of looking at it, and I think you're in line with thinking how I would on this. But someone could still come in and go, well, no, it's still 99.9% empty, because if you take it down to the atomic level, and all of a sudden they're playing a different game. I mean, I could argue against you and say, no, it's always half full no matter what, and we're playing the same game. We're having the conversation, and we could probably have different justifications. I actually agree with you, so I don't have a justification for that one off the top of my head. But, we'd still be having the same conversation. We'd be playing the same language game.
Yeah, exactly. One of the reasons... Oops, sorry.
It's all right. It's got really hot in here. So,
yeah, it's quite warm tonight. I've had to open my window, as you can probably see. Yeah. So one of the reasons Wittgenstein kind of wrote Philosophical Investigations and looked at the language game is that he was responding to the ideas of how people describe language beforehand. And he kind of focuses on something called the Augustinian View, which was a view put forward by St. Augustine. And it's this idea that words get their meanings from what they refer to. Mm-hmm. So, mouse, it refers to that. But then you also have mouse, which refers to the animal. So it seems to be that just saying that words have these references and reference, and that's where they get their meaning, it doesn't seem to kind of do justice to it. But to take it back a step further, when we learn languages, if you think back to when you're a kid, when you're in school, that it's basically how they teach you language, isn't it? Hang on, I've just seen Phillips. He changed his mind from the Tractidus to Philosophical Investigations. As far as I can remember, this is the view he held on to after that. Because, he'd once again solve philosophy. Just like he did with the Tractidus.
Yeah. He's brilliant. Solved philosophy a number of times.
Yeah, exactly. And he solved philosophy by switching views.
Yeah.
From the solving that he did before.
And that's why there are certain people who just only read him because, he solved philosophy, yeah. So why read anyone else?
But in this case, to be honest, this is one of my favorite philosophical arguments because I think it teaches us a lot. And it does something that I think philosophy should do. Yes, all the other stuff in philosophy, I'm not saying it's wrong, it's bad, or anything like that. But one of the things that philosophy is supposed to do is take the things that we take for granted and bring it into the light and show why it's right or how to fix it. Ooh, sorry, I'm just looking at the
Lens flare.
yeah.
Hey, speaking of Star Trek,
It's a J.J. Abrams film, yeah. But yeah, it kind of gives us an idea of how the world is working. It's being descriptive. It's discussing the things we take for granted, and it's pointing out ideas where we might not have the fullest picture because we're only looking at very specific things. So when we go back to being a kid, we think about how we learn languages. When you're in school, you get a picture of an apple, word on top, apple, and we learn to make those connections. And if you think about it, that does sort of describe how we learn language and how language is used to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you think of how many times you'll say to another skeptic, "What do you think this word means?" Or you're in an argument over something like what the word atheism means, or they'll just go, "I don't have to have a view. Here's the dictionary." And to them, that it's that same kind of idea about how language works. We have a word, we have a thing it refers to, and that's it. That's just how language works. But Wittgenstein he looks at it and says, well, this is kind of how it works, but you're not giving the full picture. And what he does is the first thing he kind of gives us is this idea of a primitive language. If you think about how a primitive language works, that's kind of how it is. Think
and that's referring to a rock.
Yeah, or roar and pointing, and that means there's a lion over there.
Yeah.
And as it evolves, it starts to get, I mean, you could call those utterances. Yeah, they're sounds. Those sounds have a thing that they point to that we imagine in our head. We see a picture of it, we know what it is. But as language evolves, it sort of starts to move beyond that. And the utterances aren't just a monosyllabic sound or an imitation. They become words. But the words are still utterances. So instead of "rar" for lion, we used the word lion. But as it goes on, it gets more and more complicated because more and more words appear, and sometimes those words are used to refer to various different things. So if you just say a word just has this thing that it refers to, well, what happens when it refers to several different things? And it just seems to be common sense to say, well, that depends on the context you're using it in.
Yeah, I mean, one that comes to my mind is the word lying. You know, it could describe what someone is doing. They're lying down, or they are telling lies. Just you know, and you would probably get it from the context. You know, they're lying down. But if someone says they're lying in the garden, they could technically be standing in the garden telling lies.
Yeah, that's it.
You'd probably infer it was the other one, that they're just laying down in the garden. But it could.
It would depend on the language game that you're kind of already in. If they're just asking you what he's doing and you say he's lying in the garden, most people will generally infer from that. But if something was added like he's talking to so-and-so and he's lying in the garden, rather than he's lying in the garden and he's talking to so-and-so, that gives a different context.
Make it go either way. Yeah, it does.
Yeah. And Wittgenstein gives us this example of the primitive language, and he uses something called the shopkeeper example. Most people would refer to it as Wittgenstein's shopkeeper.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this idea that you have this errand boy, and he's been sent to the shop to get 3 red apples. And he hands over the letter to the shopkeeper, who then has a drawer with apples written on it. And when he pulls out the drawer, there's a color chart. And that color chart has red, blue, and green. So he looks at the apples and he compares it to red. And then he has a counter chart. So it shows him how many apples to put in. So theoretically, you could have a conversation and kind of get meaning from these things without actually understanding the meaning of the words, because you've just, like, somebody who's foreign could use that chart to convert. Yeah. So he wouldn't understand the meaning of the words, but he would still be able to respond to them and perform actions according to them. Yeah. So meaning doesn't necessarily come from the definition, but we can just use recognition things like a child does.
Yeah.
When a child comes up to you and says up, they aren't saying up as in that goes up that way.
Yeah.
They're saying pick me up, lift me
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
They're asking for an action because that's what they've associated when you say you want to come up.
Yeah.
They don't understand the meaning.
And they might also know, I mean, my daughter does this herself. So if it's a general up, she's up. But sometimes she'll grab my hand and pull me over to, a certain part of the kitchen and then say up. And what that means is she wants to go into that cupboard where she knows the treats are.
Yeah.
And then the answer is no. No. Fuck off. But I know that she's playing a game and she has taken... so it's not fully verbal language. She knows that normal up is I want to cuddle, and I'm pulling you over here, and up is I want the cupboard, and I've learned to understand that.
That's it. So the meaning doesn't just come from the actual word itself or what the word defines, but how the word is said. And again, another example, like you say, of a language game where context, the word changes meaning within the context. Now, we can think of another example, and this is one that Wittgenstein gives us, and it's called the builder example, or Wittgenstein's builders. Now, imagine you have a building site. Now, you have 10 different people on that building site. Each one speaks a very different language, but the foreman or the guy doing the actual building points to a slab, says slab, and points back to him. So he communicates that whenever he says he wants the word slab, it means one of them has to go over, grab a slab, and bring it to him. And he does the same for brick, and he does the same for cement. So they don't actually know that the word slab refers to a paving stone. As far as they're concerned, the word slab means go and get one of those objects over there, bring it over here. So if words have a meaning, like many say words have meaning, and then use the dictionary and say this is what it means, well, that's not quite correct, because in this instance, the word slab doesn't mean that. And if you were to say, well, that's not what the word slab means, well, it seems to work in that language game. And it, eventually they can learn that slab means this, but in that context, slab means go over and get me one of these and bring it back. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, another one like that is when doctors are doing surgery, like a surgeon, and he's calling out scalpel, forceps, so on and so forth. He's saying the items he wants placed in his hand. That's the name of the item as well, but he's not just telling the person, "Oh, that's what these are called." Just so you know, he's in the middle of a surgery and he's using one word to say, "Give me this item now." Pressure, suction, this, that. Generally, they won't have to do the full level of, right, I need you to put pressure on this bit here, get the suction in on this bit. They're going to have they're playing the same game. They've played the same game enough times before that they just know, like, suction, this, that, forceps. Yeah. So, yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
It's one of the reasons I use that in the description, because if I go like that, and I'm in a situation where I'm describing things to you, I hold my hand out towards a scalpel and say, scalpel. You read that as me saying, this is a scalpel. But in that doctor's office, they hold, or in the operating theater, they hold out their hand in the same way and say, scalpel, look at a scalpel put in it. Because it's operating in two different contexts and two different language games.
Makes sense to me.
And if you think about it as well, you can change the meaning of a word. Like, think of the operating theater. Doctor holds out his hand and says, scalpel. They put a scalpel. Doctor holds out his hand and goes, scalpel, scalpel, scalpel. They know that there's an emergency.
Yep.
So words don't just get their meaning from the context or what the definition is. They also get their meaning from how it's said.
And actions that go along with it. There's the body language.
Yeah.
You know, what you did there, not only did you change your voice, you were doing a shaking hand. He was
shaking
like,
your hand.
Yeah. And all of a sudden it's, And these are things that we pick up on and we don't actually consciously think about much. Not until we sit back and go, well, why did I get that? You learn all this stuff growing up. There's so much stuff you absorb unconsciously.
You're constantly analyzing the language game that you exist in so that you can learn the rules to play a part of it. And that's sort of why Twitter and Facebook, one of the things that we hear a lot is that, well, in text, you know, things kind of lose their meaning, things lose their tone. It's easy to be misunderstood. And that's why, because when it comes to communication, words don't just have definitions. They have utterances. They have the way they're said, the actions that go along with them. The words mean different things in different contexts, like that conversation we had last week, which was a bit of a shit show. This guy doesn't know what a subjective fact is. Well, that's because in the language game I play, there's no such thing as a subjective fact. All facts are objective. You can say a fact is subjective in that it gets its meaning from a personal opinion, like this guy prefers Batman over Superman.
The preference is subjective, but the fact is that he prefers.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas for them, subjective fact meant any fact that changed and you couldn't find objective evidence for. So, I mean, I wouldn't use that because as far as I'm concerned, that's a terrible definition to use, especially in a language game. But all those people that were arguing with me existed in that language game, so they all knew what it meant. And to them, it was unquestionable. And it had never been questioned because they come into the language game and analyzed how it was being used, took it on board. And we have that anchoring bias, don't we?
We do.
So when we learn that thing, that's what that word means. And unless you understand the language games and how they work, you're going to be stuck with that. Like, how many people argue there is only one definition of something?
Yeah. I mean, this is like I discussed in the English language barrier. That's what I was saying in that article where someone thought that they were being completely clear. Everyone else tells me I'm being perfectly clear. I can't imagine a better way to say this thing. And you could explain the problems with it, but they wouldn't see those particular problems because they're in their little game of, you know, a little bubble of people that are all playing the same language game that doesn't necessarily translate to the rest of the world.
Exactly. And this is, so we can kind of get an understanding there of why Wittgenstein used the term game, because there's rules and there's the way things are done. So the way we use the words, the actions that we use to communicate all mean different things. And those rules all come from that particular game. Now, another one of the reasons that he used game is, if I was to say to you now, give me a definition of what a game is, what would you say?
Generally it would be something that is played. There is a certain level of entertainment derived from said game as well.
Do you think that would cover all instances of games?
I don't know. That was a gut reaction, Dave. I haven't done any prep.
Yeah. Prep?
And,
What's that?
yeah.
But if we think about games, let's go back to Socrates now. When you think of a Socratic dialogue, he usually starts with, can you define justice for me? Can you define virtue for me? And he's asking for this unitary definition.
He is.
And most of the times the conversation fails because people can't give this unitary definition.
I mean...
Yeah?
I mean, a game is something... The trouble is, I'm getting too caught up into the world of computer games and sporting games, and there's always seems to be this sort of competition or entertainment factor to them.
Okay, chess. You play it with a friend, it can be entertaining. You play it with a grandmaster, it's not quite so entertaining. It's challenging.
Yes.
If you talk about competitive, I can show you an example of chucking a ball against a wall. There's no competition there. There might not even be any entertainment.
I don't know. I think there could be some self-competition there. Like, I want to see if I can chuck it against the wall and catch it as many times as possible.
But there are also people who just chuck it to stave off boredom.
Yeah.
Solitaire. Yeah, that's played on your own, not necessarily.
But you're trying to complete it. There's an end goal in mind.
Yeah. So when we think of games, there's no unitary definition that seems to fit all of them. There's bits and pieces that fit them, bits and pieces that fit another.
I think we've had this sort of similar discussion before, though, that like with a lot of things, there is not necessarily a single unitary definition of these things. There's just a lot of, if you actually break it down, there's a lot of aspects of things that could be part of a game, and if it fills some of them, enough of them, there's a sort of resemblance. This is kind of like a game. This is kind of like a game, and it could be anything. It doesn't have to be a game. A job. This is like a job. This is a job. People have different things that regard as jobs. One thing that you would say is you should be getting paid for a job.
But then you have a DIY job that you do in your house.
Yeah.
Which is a job, but you don't get paid for.
Well, you do get some form of reward, though. So from a DIY job,
But that's different than being paid.
Yes. Yeah. No. But there's a reward, should I say? There is something that you get rewarded for. But yes, yeah. I misspoke. I played the wrong game.
So yeah, and this is what Wittgenstein says about games: that there's just this family resemblance. There's certain things that fit one that might not fit another, but we would still point to both of them and say they're games. And that might be how we kind of define what a game is. We simply point to it and say, that's a game, that's a game, that's a game, that's a game. And then start to work out the commonalities. So there's just family resemblances between how we label these things, and it's the same with a language game. There's not this one overriding thing that we can define as a language game, because, like you said, the language game played at work might be different to the language game played at home, played with your best friends. Don't talk about doing lines of coke at work. Don't call the guy next to you a cock at work. Yeah, so it's a different kind of language game. I know most people in Britain do.
No, you just reminded me. I started work at this company. I started work as a temp. This was years and years ago, and the guy was, awfully polite. He was like, "Oh, so do you prefer to be called Joe or Joseph?" And I just said, "You can call me cunt if you like. I really don't care."
Yeah.
And he was really taken aback, and he couldn't hold back the laughter. And he went, "You and me are gonna get on."
Nice one.
But yes, generally you wouldn't say that sort of thing, and actually that was something incredibly impulsive that just came out without me even thinking about it. Usually in that situation you'd be so nervous you wouldn't say anything like that. You'd be like, "Oh God, I was just No.
And now, if you think about it, those same work rules, the language game that's played at work, going to be different in America as it is in Britain, as it is in Japan, as it is in China. So we would say they're all work language games, but they're not all the same. And there's
No.
not one thing that makes them all that. They just are that because they're in that context. And we say that's the Japanese work language game.
Mm.
And when we think about games in general, we break them down. That's a video game. That's a video FPS game.
An RPG, an MMORPG.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a board game. That's a tabletop role-playing game. So we define these things not by this unitary definition like Socrates often asked for and why he won most arguments. Perhaps the reason he won most is because what he was asking for wasn't quite possible. He was playing a language game where the rules were rigged in his favor.
Bastard. Do we have time to answer some of the chat? I haven't.
Yeah, of course.
Cool. So, Kimmo, sorry, Kimmo, it's about 18 minutes ago you made this point.
I'm sorry, Kimmo.
Yeah,
I get kind of caught up in my own bullshit.
He says, J.L. Austin's ideas about speech act theory are pretty important in any review of language use. Do you know much about that, Dave?
Sorry, say that again.
J.L. Austin's ideas about speech act theory are pretty important in every review of language use.
I haven't read it, but I know of the book, and I know of speech act theory, but it defines the different kinds of acts. Like, if you think about something like I marry you when you're getting married,
right? Yeah, and
you're not just making a statement.
Yeah,
it's an action. Some questions, some speech acts are questions, some speech acts are commands, some speech acts are like denotative, kind of descriptive things that we say about the world. So there's different kinds of speech acts and things like that. But I haven't read that particular book, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's fair. Command Cyborg says something that looks to be French. It says "Ceci n'est pas une pipe." Does that say I don't smoke the pipe? I don't know.
It's possible. It's been a long. I haven't actually studied French since I left Canada, and that was like 40 years ago.
Merde. Lone Wolf says, I demand you stop making me imagine so much. This is too much work. I can't imagine a world where people find Joe perfectly clear. These thought exercises are just too hard for me. I don't think anyone finds me clear, do they?
Yeah, nobody ever finds me clear either. I'm about as clear as muddy water with Coke spilled into it.
What kind of Coke?
The drinkable kind, unfortunately.
Boring. Can you... Okay, so sorry, I should go back. Lone Wolf says, games have rules. Some say the only game is finding your way around any rule. Can you tell me a game that doesn't have a rule? That's an interesting one, because even the game has a rule. And everybody just
but
lost.
Not all things that have rules. Yeah. That's been a long time since I heard that. But not all things with rules are a game.
This is true. So yeah, there's more to it. Again, it comes into the family resemblance, but that's one thing that they probably all have.
Yeah. I suppose so, because if you play a game that you make up, you usually make up some rules about how the game works.
Yeah. Even when you're a kid and you're inventing a fantasy world and you're going off in places, there's all these rules of things, and yeah, well, we're invincible, we're this, blah, da, 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 but there's you create a rule set, even as vague and watery as it might be. So yeah, Lone Wolf, I'd agree with you. That is one thing that games definitely all have, but it's not the only thing that they have. Unless you regard things like the law or school as games in themselves. If I suppose you could break everything down and say it's some form of game, but that seems a little too broad for me. That's like overly broadening.
You're broadening it to the point where there's no actual use for the term. It's just saying the word game means everything.
Yeah. Oh, everything with a rule.
Yeah. Sort of like saying atheism is everything that lacks a belief in God.
Yeah, fuck overly broad terminology. Nathantus says, the next time a right-winger asks what is a woman, I'm going to ask them what is a game. Good.
that's the way to go about it.
And say you're looking for a unitary definition.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So Kimo says it's difficult to distinguish games from sports sometimes. The proposed definitions frequently fall short. I'd say sports are forms of games, personally.
Yeah, well, that's why they're called sports games.
Yeah. And sometimes you have games that are sports games as well, which, video games that are sports games.
Yeah, and that it shows you the sort of family resemblance and the blurring of lines that comes from this stuff. Because think of the debate now going on as to whether esports games are a sport.
Yeah. And I'd say no. But then I don't even think golf and snooker should really be regarded as sports. They take a lot of skill, but I think there has to be the potential of getting really hurt for it to be a sport.
The only real sports are kickboxing and jiu-jitsu.
And extreme sports.
It's all yelling extreme and jumping off a mountain. There's no sport there. There's just attempted suicide.
Lone Wolf says, for the record, if you tell the boss you were snorting coke off someone's cock, you might be surprised by the reaction you get. Yeah.
Last time I did it, I got fired. So I wasn't surprised.
Kimo says, or you can just go with Hemingway's notion that only mountaineering, automobile racing, and bullfighting are sports, and the rest are just games.
That doesn't sound like jiu-jitsu and kickboxing.
Close enough. So Nathantus says, referring to the famous "This is not a pipe" painting, I assume. I don't know the painting.
It sort of brings me back to what I was saying about the images I chose. This is a table.
Yes.
If I'd reversed it to this is not a table, then the actual language game being played, is that what you're seeing is a picture of a table?
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense. That's basically what we were discussing right at the beginning anyway. It's the fact that, yeah. And then you could say, well, it's not actually a picture, it's the pixels because they're represented on the screen. And then those are just electrons and blah, blah, blah. There's, even a chair's not a chair. Chairs don't exist.
Well, what makes something a chair?
I watched a long, I think it was about half an hour video on that. And I came away going, I definitely know
There's
less.
no such thing as a chair.
Yeah.
I mean, a table is a chair if you sit on it.
Yeah. A lot of it came down to the use that we give it at the time, and then that's the same sort of thing with the language, isn't it?
We point to it and we say, this is a chair, this is a chair, this is a chair. And there's a sort of family resemblance that comes from pointing at all these things, but there is no essence of a chair.
No. Makes sense. Kimo says, I don't think tossing a frisbee around has rules. Well, you have to catch it. If you don't catch it, you didn't catch it. And actually, there's ultimate frisbee. So people have turned Frisbee into a sport. But yeah, the game, it's a very loose rule, but you're supposed to throw and catch the Frisbee. That's the game. Like,
Or Frisbee golf.
Yeah, another one that's good fun.
Yeah. Playing Frisbee on your own, the only rule is, as Lone Wolf pointed out, you have to throw the Frisbee.
Yeah.
That's the rule. Otherwise, you're not
playing Frisbee. Yeah, you're just holding a Frisbee.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, to be playing something. So there is still at least some rule. So I see his comment just down there. Yeah, the rule is you must throw the Frisbee, otherwise you aren't playing Frisbee throw. Yeah, you're right. John says chess is a sport, I believe. It might be regarded as one. It's a very taxing game. It's absolutely brilliant, but again, like golf and snooker, whilst there is the skill there, and there is a lot of skill, there isn't really the risk of getting hurt. So I don't see them quite as sports. I think there has to be that risk of getting hurt. But that's a personal distinction, and I know I'm against the majority of the world when I say that. I still think there's, people have a lot of skill and they've trained really hard and to do these things. But part of what I would think of as a sport would regard these things as the potential to get hurt. And with chess, a grumpy opponent might get up and hit you over the head with the chessboard, but that's pretty unlikely if you're going professional.
I've never done anything like that.
Kimmo says Austin and Searle would probably call the table chair mix-up metalocutionary speech act. You want to explain that for me, Dave?
Okay. Basically, they're mixing up, and they're kind of mixing up two different language games. To put it in a way that we're kind of discussing tonight, they're using how we would describe one thing and describing another thing using it, even though we shouldn't be. Sort of in the simplest of terms.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because a table has a specific function. We know it's a table. If we sit on it, we're not using it as a table. We're describing it as something that it's not because we're using it in a way that we're not supposed to be using it. If that makes sense.
No, it does, definitely. This one won't leave me alone tonight. What are you doing?
Yeah, my dog's been wandering around.
Maybe they can smell each other through the internet. Imagine if they could. Got smell-o-vision going on. John says, you should be thinking so hard, you just have a brain aneurysm that's an injury, but I don't think you get a brain aneurysm from thinking too much, to be honest. No, I don't think you do. I mean, if you've got some form of clot or similar and you're prone to having aneurysms, maybe you've got a thinning of the... Right, that's all my medical knowledge jumping out of my brain. The vascular system within your brain is as far as I can come. If they start thinning, then maybe you could cause an aneurysm by causing a lot of stress from overthinking. Maybe, I don't know. But yes, okay. I am going to switch it back to you now, Dave. Sorry. I'm glad we've caught up with the chat there. And Command Cyborg managed to actually catch up with the live stream because I spent a long time trying to answer the chat. So, 2 birds, 1 stone.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay. So, as I said at the beginning, Wittgenstein said that, a lot of linguistic muddles and confusion comes from using one language game in another language game. And this is why he felt that he solved problems of philosophy. So Think of a question like, are numbers real?
What do you mean by real?
Yeah, exactly. So when a mathematician speaks about numbers being real, they would be using that word real in a specific way, in a way that relates to mathematics. Now, if we say our numbers real, and we speak about them as having this ontological reality, like they're objects that maybe exist in this other realm and that come down to this realm, like in a Platonic kind of way. But we have our representations, but they still have this ontological reality. We've got into a muddle because we're taking the language game of ontology and applying it to mathematics. So we're trying to come up with this very convoluted kind of description of how they're real when it's got nothing to do with it. We should be speaking in terms of the mathematical language game, and then therefore muddle solved. All the problems of philosophy solved.
All the problems. All of them.
All of them, yeah. But that was his argument, that a lot of the time the problems that we have in philosophy are because we're mixing these language games. I'm not so sure that that's entirely true. I can see where he's coming from, and I think that probably is the case in many instances. But I think this applies more to the real world as well. And that's why I said I really like this argument, because it's one of those things that philosophy should be doing, and helping us to untangle the real world a bit and helping us to solve some of the confusion that goes on here. And if you think about it, this kind of thing, if more people understood it, it might also help solve some of the hostility.
It might. I think part of the problem is people are almost aware in a certain sense that these language games exist, not by calling them language games, but they know that there is no inherent meaning to words. They're defined through use. They'll say this. I mean, we'll hear a number of our fellow atheists say the same thing. And then it gets to a word that they're passionate about, maybe the definition of atheism, and no, this is the use. And you're like, okay.
Yeah, that's because the language game that they're playing is trying to win an argument.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if they want to win this argument that atheism only has one definition and it's this, you have to start with the words get their meaning from usage. This is how we use the term, but we are atheists, so we get to define how the term is used, and we as atheists say there is only one definition, therefore you have to use that definition. So they're playing that language game of trying to win an argument, trying to put across an ideology, and they're not speaking of the words get their meaning from usage in the linguistics way. They're speaking of it in a way that I get to define how this word is used because I am this word. Therefore, you must use this word in the way that we mean it.
And it's probably why when you turn around and go, well, I'm an atheist and I use it this way, they go into the tribal mode and other you, because they're playing their language game still of only one use, and all of a sudden, no, you're clearly not an atheist because that's not how atheists define the word.
Yeah. And here's a sort of metaphor I was thinking about this afternoon. Now, if you think about the language game in the sense of it being a game, and now a lot of atheists will say, well, if you lack a belief in God, you're an atheist, whether you like it or not. Okay. Imagine a group of people. Do people still play Bulldog?
Like British Bulldog?
Yeah.
You're not allowed to play it in schools anymore, but we did when I was at school.
Okay, but most people would understand what it is. People stand at one side of the field, other people stand at the other. One side rushes and they have to try and get past. Anybody who doesn't try to get past gets caught up and they're dragged into that side.
Yeah, and you used to tackle people, and now if it got to a point where you just had to tap people, and now you're just not allowed to play it.
Okay, now imagine there was a football field where that game was being played.
Are we
And
using it as soccer, or are we talking American football?
no, we're talking about bulldog.
Right.
Yeah,
Just,
yeah. Sorry.
Just, so which game are we playing, Dave? Between your accent and
bulldog. They call it Red Rover in the States. Okay, so bulldog, Red Rover, whatever you want to call it. Now imagine there's this group of people that are playing this game in this field. Now imagine if everybody that walked past, they grabbed and pulled in and said, right, you're playing bulldog now. And they said, well, I don't want to play bulldog. And said, well, you're either playing bulldog or you're not playing bulldog. You're on the field, so you're obviously playing bulldog. Now, most people who get dragged into that game are going to be pretty pissed off because they didn't want to play. Yeah, it's not their game. They didn't ask to play. They prefer chess or they prefer football or what have you. Now, if you think of that kind of atheism in the sense of a language game or a game, what those atheists are doing when they say, if you're not a theist, you're an atheist and you're therefore playing our game, is equivalent to that. They're dragging people who don't want to play the game into the game, and I'm wondering why people are getting angry at being dragged into the game.
That's a really good way to put it. If I remember, which I won't, I'm going to clip that bit out.
I just felt like that was a pretty apt description, or like somebody's just mentioned, Dave's just mentioned dodgeball. It's like somebody dragging you into a game of dodgeball when you didn't want to play because you don't like dodgeball. Yeah. And it's like, well, you're playing dodgeball whether you like it or not. So get in here, have a ball to the face.
Yeah. You could think of anything like that. You know, you walk onto a playground and you're forced to play whatever game is currently being played just because you're walking across the playground. Or
yeah. Or because you happen to have blonde hair like the team on that side instead of black hair like the team on that side. So you're now in the blonde team. Whether you like it or not, you're in the blonde team or in the black hair team. Yeah. Without meaning to sound Aryan.
I mean, it could have been worse. It could have come across really racist. So, but yeah, that's fair. Yeah, it is really similar to that, isn't it? It's. I mean, the purpose of the language games, more often than not, should be to convey your idea and communicate with someone, get someone to understand what you're saying. You know, that's the point of language and communication.
Yeah,
get someone to understand what you're saying. But some people are playing a different language game. They're not trying to be understood. They're trying to be right.
Yeah, like you say, they're in the language game of winning rather than the language game of discussing or the language game of exploration or and you know, that language game of exploration could be set in terms of science, or it could be set in terms of figuring out what the best kind of TV shows are. And Wittgenstein also discusses it in terms of spirituality and science. And his view has gone on to actually encourage a lot of discussions from the religious. So when we think about, and this brings up some other points going forward about how skeptics discuss stuff. Now, when you think about how many skeptics go, there is no evidence for God. There's no testable, repeatable, physical evidence. We can't empirically verify it. Therefore, I've just realized something I forgot to say, but it's irrelevant now. We'll sort of get the point here. they'll say that because we can't test this thing and we can't find out if it's true or false, it has no real meaning. And they'll say, you know, religion has no meaning because, none of the things are true. None of the things can be verified. Everything comes out false. But what they're doing is they're actually playing the science game, whereas spirituality is a different game. So spirituality doesn't care whether things are true or false. I mean, it does, but
I know what you
it's
mean.
being a bit overbroad. Yeah, they care about cultivation of character, getting in touch with themselves, getting in touch with the world, getting in touch with the universe, depending on the kind of spirituality. So they were applying the science language game to the spirituality game and saying, well, it has no meaning. But if they were within the spirituality game, evidence means something else. And what they're aiming for isn't true or false, it's very different things. So within that language game, there is meaning.
Yeah, that makes sense. Kimmo's got a good point. It's like the marriage game. You can be right or you can be happy. You cannot be both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, the marriage game is something you actually enter into as an action when you say, I marry you. You
Yep.
join that game and you agree to the rules where either one is right or one is happy. You can't be both.
But equally, right? I could marry you and Emma, but that wouldn't be me actually getting married to you two.
No, exactly. I now marry
Yeah.
thee.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, you could use the bride and the groom could use I marry thee to each other. Same words means a different thing and is a different action. And the one who is, what are they called? One who oversees the wedding?
Jeff.
Minister.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll just go with priest or minister or whatever. When they say I now marry thee, using the same words, but it's meaning something else and it's performing a different action. So
yeah.
if words have meaning, well, it gets them from how they're used in the context in which they're used.
Brilliant. Right, I am going to take 2 minutes to go and get myself another drink. So if anyone has any questions or anything like that, get them in over the break and I will address them afterwards. And we will be back in 2 minutes or less is my guess, right? You can
No
start
worries.
the timer anytime from now. So I'm back. Sorry, that took me slightly longer than I predicted. The wife has got back from seeing her mother. It's her mother's birthday, which I unfortunately couldn't go to because I was streaming.
Well, time is relative. So
and that's a relative.
yeah.
So yes. Were there any chat messages before we continue, Dave? Kimmo agrees that a drink sounds like a capital idea. Capital, there you go. There's so many different uses for the word capital, like a capital, capital FM.
And
Your
Claire
money.
said,
Sort of
if Dave's going to keep talking, I need a drink.
Yeah. Don't blame me, Claire. Why do you think I drink so much on these streams?
Why do you think I don't drink? Because I would chat even more shit than I do now.
As was seen last Tuesday.
Yeah, poor
Thursday?
Luke.
No, that was brilliant. That's brilliant. I hope that the pair of us have more time to join him occasionally on a Monday.
To be the guest, yeah.
And wind him up and derail him constantly. So yeah. Oh yeah, throw Joe in there too, to be fair. Yeah, I mean, I don't blame you. Again, as much as I may drink to deal with chatting to Dave, I also drink to deal with just being me. So
I do drugs for that.
So there you go. Right. So language games.
Yeah. Games that we play when we're younger, so that we can learn how to use language efficiently. That's what a language game is. In school. So that's a language game, playing language games.
I know you are, but what am I?
But no. Get back to what we were saying about skeptics and atheists and mixing up language games. Now, as I was saying earlier with the subjective and objective definitions, where an fact definitions, where a subjective fact is one that can change, and only the subject can know the truth of it. And an objective fact is a fact that will never change and can be verified independently. Now, in that circle where that's used, I suppose that's, it's a definition. And within that context, people use it and it has meaning, but it has no meaning to me. Because when I look at those definitions and I break them down, they fall apart within 5 questions.
They do.
But if you think about it, like Wittgenstein says, a lot of muddle happens when you mix up language games. Now, let's think about the burden of proof discussion.
God.
Yeah, but that's an example of...
It's a good example. It's just, I've had that conversation so many times. It was
Yeah, they're using the sort of courtroom, the legalistic burden of proof. But at the same time, they're mixing it in with the scientific burden of proof, where the burden is on the one making the claim. It's not up to me to dispute the claim. It's up to them to provide evidence. But then when it comes to the evidence, it's, well, no, this doesn't count as evidence, even though it counts as evidence in that particular language game.
And it would.
Basing it off. Yeah. And then it all starts to become quite muddled, and you find them getting into a muddle. Well, only this is evidence. It's like, well, in this analogy that you're using, it's not just evidence. In their language game that they play amongst other skeptics, all that makes sense. But from somebody coming outside, if you were to analyze it, you could see how they were using it and how they were playing that game. But to anybody outside that game, none of that really makes sense. And it's because there is this muddle going on where they're mixing up these different language games and trying to create a new game out of it. And because the overall game that they're playing is the game of winning an argument and showing theists to be wrong, it creates this whole haphazard, piecemeal kind of game, whose rules change according to when they want to win. And another example of the mixing up of the language games is religious people are deluded. Okay.
Or even delusional. They'll say delusional as well.
Yeah. Within a colloquial language game, you could sort of say the word delusional doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as it means in the psychological language game. Delusional has this particular meaning colloquially where it's just, you believe this crazy thing and you won't change your mind. Or you're wrong and you won't change your mind, even though I presented you this evidence. But then lots of them will take it that little bit further and say they're clinically insane. Yeah. Psychology and psychiatry says that they're clinically insane, and they'll mix up the language games and then get frustrated. And that's when you end up getting blocked. I mean, think of the amount of atheists that have blocked us for pointing all this stuff out. But their arguments would actually go better if they didn't do all this. If they stuck to one language game where delusional just meant you're wrong and you won't change your mind. But the problem is if they do that and they stick to that language game, then they're delusional too, because atheism has more than one definition outside of their language game. They won't change their mind and say, well, in this other language game, yes, it has this definition. We don't use it. They say, well, that language game is wrong. They're not playing the game properly. But it's like a Risk player saying they use money in their game. Well, then they're playing the game wrong. That's not how you play Risk.
Yeah.
But they're not playing Risk. Yeah.
So, going along the delusional point, actually, I've had a few conversations with people where they actually think that they take, they start with what you're saying is, they believe something unrealistic or something that seems crazy to them or whatever, and that's why they're delusional. They're not using the medical terminology, and then they go, but the medical terminology means this, so they should be classed as insane. And one of the responses we got to Luke's stream on what is psychology, right? This was on our Facebook page, was it's not credible because it calls Bible thumpers sane. I mean, how like embedded must you be in your own ideology to go, well, I'm going to reject the science?
Yeah. And the funny thing is their language game, in their language game, science should never be rejected, because if you reject science, you're delusional.
Yeah.
But they'll change the rules of that game to kind of win the argument and to keep hold of the ideology.
Well, I know we joke that psychology is a pseudoscience, but we don't actually believe that. But that's the way they'll turn it. Well, it's a soft science, so it doesn't count. Yeah,
I believe it's a pseudoscience so much I've got a degree in it. I should know.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we make those jokes just because we find it funny, and for some reason, it's one of those jokes that the more we say it, the more we laugh. And I'm sure you guys get tired of it, but the fact that we keep on laughing at it, it just keeps us entertained. And
we're here for ourselves. You
exactly.
Just happen to tag along. Yeah.
That's the game we play. So, yeah, it's kind of like, well, as you mentioned, it's delusional in itself, isn't it? Really, just to be so dedicated to being right, to winning this point. Like, you don't even want to be correct. You want to be seen as right.
You want to be slandering the outgroup. You want to make the outgroup look as bad as possible. And because in that language game they exist in, like, this goes back to your example with the bald guy. I can't remember his name now. Another one that blocked me. Dale, that's it.
Oh yeah, blocked me ages ago.
Yeah. Everybody else knows what I mean. Everybody else thinks the language I'm using is completely clear. And that's because in that language game, that statement means something. It doesn't matter whether it means something well. It doesn't matter whether it's explained well. The meaning they get is that religious people are dumb and deluded. Oh, I agree with that point. Then that statement must be clear and correct. But outside of that group, outside of that game, you're going to look at it and go, that doesn't make sense.
Well, I even pointed out to Dale in that conversation, I mean, this was back in the English language barrier article, wasn't it? It was the fact that people responded differently. He was saying, oh no, I just mean that they believe something that's wrong. That's how he was using it. I don't mean that they're crazy. I mean that they're just believing something in the face of evidence. And other people responding, going, no, I agree that they should be classed as delusional, from a psychological point of view, and psychology is wrong. And it's like, right, you see, this is a problem. They're using terminology that's loaded with, generally, when you're saying delusional. See, the thing is, like, you can say deluded, and it's not necessarily as strong as someone that's delusional. Right?
Yeah.
In the same way that someone can feel depressed, but they might not be suffering with depression. But there might be better words to use than saying depressed, because someone
But
might go,
broke
oh,
it
does that
down.
mean you're suffering with depression? Someone might ask that. And it's the same thing with deluded. This person's been deluded. What, do you think they've got a delusional disorder? No, that's not what I'm saying. Well, then why are you saying that they're deluded? Because surely there's that link there. And that's not how they're using it. You're at that point, you're talking past each other, you're playing different games. Now, someone might be clarifying, and I think it's good to clarify the language. Like, is this what you mean by this? No, it's not. But then my next question is, why are you using language that is loaded with this bias that can be used in some other way? Okay, you're saying deluded. Why can you not say they're mistaken, or they've accepted false things, or they've been taken down a path and convinced certain things are true that are not? There's so many ways you can do this without using a term that can be linked to a psychological condition.
That's because within that language game that they're playing, it's not just the rules of how the words work, but the rules of how the words should be intended to be used. Part of the rule is to make the opposite side look as bad as possible.
Which is unfortunate. And again,
it really is, yeah.
I would say that people that are playing a language game where the game is to win and score points and have pats on the backs from each other, they're not playing the right game. We've had a comment come in saying, yeah, true, and honestly, nothing wrong with being mindful. And yeah, I've heard from a friend that had delusions and they were like, it would be used to use another word. So I did. And that's absolutely fantastic that you would turn around and use different language, because I suppose you've had someone in your life who's actually suffered delusions, and all of a sudden that's something that's a little bit closer to you, and you can realize that there is a big difference from someone who suffers delusions and people that just believe stuff that's wrong. You can think that what any theist believes is completely wrong for any number of reasons, but they're not necessarily delusional. Right? They can be as wrong as they come. Right? You can have justifications for thinking they're wrong. Now, what you say is, you say they're disingenuous or willfully ignorant. Now, they might be, and it depends on the type of religious person you're speaking about, right? They might not be as well. I mean, I have actually met a number of theists that I would say were very decent people, and they seem quite rational in their positions. I don't agree with their conclusions. And I think there's some errors in their thinking. But they're not willfully ignorant. And they accept, mainstream science, as often gets thrown out there. They're on board with everything. They just have some form of theistic belief. It might be a form of Christianity, or it might be a form of secular theism. They may be Hindu or whatever. But they seem very, very together as a person. They just have this theistic belief. They just have a different, ontological position to me. And they're not necessarily willfully ignorant. I would say your average creationist is. But even then, there are some that have fully looked into it and they go, it just doesn't make sense to me. I've looked into it as much as I can, and this just seems so out there. It seems far more likely that, God did it all, and so on and so forth. Do you know what? They're not necessarily willfully ignorant. They're just wrong.
Well, let's mix in another idea into this. So you've got the language game that they exist in, and one that they've learned, and it talks about a bunch of different stuff, and they use words in a different way. Like Kimmo brought up a good thing earlier. Theory means guess. Evolution is a theory, therefore evolution is a guess.
Yeah, that's a very common one. Let's bring that one up there. Yeah. It's on the screen now.
Yeah, so that's a pretty common one. But now let's mix in the idea not only of existing within a particular language game, but existing within a particular epistemic bubble using that language game. So everything that they know exists within this bubble, and they've grown up within this bubble and learning in this bubble, and we all have the cognitive bias of anchoring bias. We all have certain biases that lead us to believe that what we think we know must be correct. Like, how many times have I heard, well, you can't have learned this topic because you're saying this and it's actually this. And they think because they think this particular thing, that must be what it is. We all have this bias where what we think we know, and we have this narrative about ourselves that, we are the best fact checkers. Therefore, what I know is a fact must be a fact. The other person must be wrong. So they might not be willfully ignorant. They might just exist in this particular epistemic bubble. And the language game they exist in means that they don't go outside of that epistemic bubble, or they believe that whatever comes from outside the epistemic bubble is wrong. I mean, we see it within the atheist community as well.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not just, it's not just necessarily disingenuous or willfully ignorant. It might just be that their thinking isn't particularly good. Yeah. Or the information they have isn't particularly good.
And I mean, I can hold my hands up and say I've been very guilty of this sort of thinking myself in the past.
I'd say everybody.
I'd be surprised if people haven't. I really would. And it's one of the reasons why I'm quite passionate about the streams and the articles that we do, because it's like I'm trying to share the mistakes that I've made so other people don't have to make them. Like, I've been incredibly wrong, guys. Don't be as wrong as me. And you know what? I'm going to be incredibly wrong again about a number of different things. I'm just a bit more careful about, and I'll probably spend more time going, is this right? To a number of people that I think know a lot more than me.
Exactly, yeah.
So, Lone Wolf says, I can answer this. The reason people use specific terms due to modern characteristic restrictions and need for being pithy and expedient phraseology. Succinct in 256 characters or less. I think it's 280 characters, actually. But yes, I will say that that's one of the negative problems with... not that there's a positive problem, but one of the negatives about Twitter is the fact that it does inspire this need to reduce your points into oversimplifications. And sometimes you have to use words that contain a lot of information. And that's why, one of the reasons why I prefer concise terminology. So it's why I prefer the very concise version of atheism versus the broad definition of atheism. Because if someone uses, atheist to mean that someone that believes gods don't exist, then I know what they mean. Whereas if someone's using it to mean someone that lacks a belief in gods, it's like, okay, so what do you believe about this topic? Are you an agnostic? Are you an apatheist? Are you... something else, I don't know. And I can understand, any form of non-theist being equated to atheist. Like, that's fine. I'm not going to tell you can't use that terminology. But to me, it seems that you're oversimplifying the terms and you're losing a lot of the meaning behind the term. And all of a sudden, we're having to ask extra questions for me to go, well, what do you mean by this term? Okay, now that I know what you mean by this term, I can use this term for you, but now I'm going to have to ask an extra 10 questions to find out all the other things around this terminology. But yeah, I definitely agree with you there. Yeah, I don't want to add on the issue of ableism not using words correctly. It's something to navigate for sure. Yeah, you're definitely right there. And you're also right that the word limit can be an issue. Oh, and thank you. You like the background colour, and we've got a cool setup. Well, there you go, Philip. Someone likes our design. If you didn't know, Philip is someone who is regularly on the stream with us, although he's been very busy recently, so he hasn't been on as much. But he always complains about our design and how he thinks it's crap and overly complicated, and But we like the sort of retro, glitchy gamer vibe, and so that's us. Oh, Kimo says epistemic authority is a cool part of topics like virtue ethics and epistemology at large. That's a really interesting point, actually.
Yeah, and this kind of speaks to what I was mentioning earlier about how there is no one language game to rule them all. Like, a lot of people like to argue that science is how we should discuss everything. But, they say that science is the epistemic authority for all that we know. How many times have we heard of only science can give us knowledge? But clearly that isn't true. Like the meme I shared the other day, only testable, repeatable, peer-reviewed things can give us knowledge. Just tell me what's on at the cinema later. Yeah, we can get knowledge without science. You're taking it into a vice-like territory when you're going that radical with it.
And that vice is called scientism.
Yeah.
Yeah. So definitely. Good point here. All right. Is this how you say Zurich 6? Zurich 6?
He says crisis.
Crisis. Oh, that's a sexy spelling of crisis. Oh, turn me on a little bit there. People need to learn how to have a conversation and listen and respond versus talking around and only reacting when someone else is to someone else is saying. And that's right. I mean, people do this far too much. There's far too much fight-like mentality with conversations that happen online. And there's too much on Twitter, especially responding to the last message sent. There's a few people that we've conversed with over the time, haven't we, Dave? Where they've basically responded to the last message each time, and every single time they're contradicting the last message that we've sent them, not realizing that they're also contradicting something that they've said before by their new message. They're trying to win each message in the stage, but they're not actually having a consistent epistemology, I suppose you could refer to it as.
Yeah.
And Lone Wolf says, and that's why I say the word atheist in general doesn't tell me anything. When I hear a person use it, they tell me nothing about themselves. Well, I mean, it depends what you mean there. Online, it tells you only one thing, that they probably lack belief in gods. If you're doing it within philosophy or you're on this channel, it probably means that they believe gods don't exist. But we're not going to tell someone who comes onto this channel who identifies as an atheist but might have an agnostic position, that they're not an atheist, because I really don't care. That's their identity. That's down to them, and I'll respect their identity. I think their identity is far more important to my language preference, even though it might irk me a little bit. But that's cool. I like it. You're an artist and a musician, and you love retro glitchy. That's awesome. I'd like to say I was an artist and a musician. I used to make music, but it was not very good at all. And it's what we tend to use, apart from when I'm having a mix on the old turntables. It's what we tend to use for the intros, like the tracks that I made when I was a teenager, which was unfortunately a very long time ago now. But if you ever want to chuck a track over, I can always chuck it up as an intro. Come on, Cyborg. I'd like to say I'm a hard lacktheist, but that wouldn't be right unless it didn't exist already and I could define it. Yeah. Cool. So also saying it depends on on someone's belief, but it's not the entire basis of a person or their personality or everything they believe. I'm agnostic and was raised Christian, but yeah. See, there you go. So you're probably using the term agnostic in the way that we would expect you to. I probably would say you're probably using it in the weak agnostic sense, in the sense that you're unsure, or you say you don't know whether God exists or does not exist. You're basically on the fence, which is fine. And there will be people out there that will tell you, well, you're not believing in a God, so therefore you must be an atheist because that's what's It's like, well, no, because there's a load of different types of non-theist, and you don't have to be regarded as an atheist. But there are people who play a game where it is a binary option. You're either a theist or an atheist, and that's why you get people saying anything not a theist is an atheist, and that's why rocks are atheist. And you go, really, Aaron?
I would never criticize Aaron or mock him. Never. Not ever.
Definitely didn't create an account that I use for those purposes.
And I definitely didn't create a video called The Ridiculousness of Atheist Rocks or whatever it was called.
I definitely haven't done tons of articles around this thing as well.
No.
No, not us. Yeah. Lone Wolf, I'm neither theist or atheist. Yeah, and a lot of people aren't. That's just it, right? Clairview, those are not the only choices. You're right. They're not the only choices. I'd agree with you. But there are people out there that will assert that. And that's one of the problems. I mean, at the end of the day, if someone who would, the way I see things, be an agnostic or an apatheist or an agnostic or something like that, wants to be known as an atheist, I don't care. That's fine with me. That's fine, right? You're an atheist. Cool. You're an agnostic atheist if you want. I mean, there was a label there already. It was agnostic, but you want to be known as an agnostic atheist. Fine. Whatever. Bit of a nonsensical term, but I get what you mean by that. You're basically an agnostic. I'll do that translation in my head, because let's not have this argument, right? It's pointless. But you're right. It's not the only choices, right? They're not the only things to be known as. So, there you go. Why do we always get onto this, Dave? It's because of these Somerset drinks.
That's why I don't drink during a stream where actually I'm supposed to say things. I mean, let's face it, a lot of what I said was really shortcutty and skimmed through a lot of stuff and rushed through. But, you know, we've only got a limited amount of time. If people really want to know the ins and outs of Wittgenstein's philosophy, language games philosophy, I can always create a slideshow type stream.
And I think that'd be great. And I think that anyone who does want to, I mean, we say this all the time, anyone who wants to know more about anything that we've discussed, all you need to do, leave us a comment, and we'll either do a video that, you know, a pre-record where we go into it, or we'll do a live stream deep dive and go into it in more detail. Because I think that what we do with a lot of our live streams is we try and cover the overall topic as quickly as possible. And sometimes that quickly as possible is 3 to 4 hours, because we're skirting around the edges and going on a number of different tangents that come up, especially when we've got some of our lovely people in the chat distracting us. And it's my favourite bit of the night, if I'm honest. But honestly, if anyone wants to address anything in more detail, and in fact, if you know a topic, and if you really know a topic well, come on and have the conversation with us, because I'd love to learn more. I love these streams. I learn so much doing them, and I love discussing the ideas. And we've had a number of fantastic guests on tell us their side of things, and I don't have to agree with you. We fucking had Muslims on. We've had people who've got really strange beliefs that didn't really know what they were saying.
They existed in their own language game.
Yeah.
And nobody's going to figure that shit out. No analyst is going to.
But they were still good conversations. I really enjoyed it. And, at the end of the day, I'm about the conversation. So if any of you have anything you want to discuss with us and you want to come on stream, you're more than welcome to do it in the future. But Dave, is there anything more that you think we need to cover tonight?
No, I think that basically sums up. And my purpose for this wasn't so much to give a detailed explanation of what Wittgenstein argument was, but to just give the basics of it and to understand how it might apply to skeptics and atheists in the community, and show how maybe the game that they're playing is different to the game that the person that they're speaking to is. And maybe if they thought about it a little more, communication might be better, and the same goes for theists. Many theists do it as well. Many theists will say, well, an atheist is somebody who believes God doesn't exist, and they'll say that to somebody who uses the lack of belief definition and say, well, you're using the term wrong. Well, they're not, because they're existing in a sort of different language game to the one, and you're mixing language games, and that's not going to work if you want to have a good, conducive, productive discussion. Of course, if you don't want to have one, then knock yourself out.
Yeah, but then why are you getting involved in those conversations in the first place?
Exactly.
Speaking of the conversations with theists, today I released my 100th post on Answers in Reason, and
it's a good one.
I'm not sure it's good.
It is.
It's long. Could you imagine how long it would take me to read that one out on air?
3-part stream. Look what happened when we were at the Aaron Raw post.
Oh, God,
that was just a post.
Yeah.
3-hour streams.
Yeah. Although we took a 1-minute video and it took us 3 hours to answer at one point, didn't it?
Yeah, because we're babbling bastards.
We are indeed. But no, so this article is why I believe gods don't exist. And it's what I view God or gods as, and defines, certain gods that I don't think should be regarded as gods. So I'm not arguing against them because I don't think they're gods. And then it goes into what led me to a form of non-theism, and or at least out of Christianity in the first place. And then it's the arguments that have firmed up my atheism, essentially, that have made me more and more sure that gods don't exist. And whilst I don't claim knowledge that no gods exist, I will say that there are specific claims that I do feel I know are logically incoherent and therefore don't exist. And thank you very much, Claire, for the compliment. She says, I love that read. Truly, it was good. Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's yeah, it's nice to get feedback like that. I love writing, and it's nice that someone else reads your writing and appreciates it. It's a weird one. It is though, isn't it, Dave? Like there's something about someone else appreciating something you've done that adds a little bit of, I don't know, I don't know what to it, but there's just something nice about it.
I don't know, because nobody ever appreciates anything that I do.
You know that's not true. The number of conversations we've had about your articles. So, any last comments before we finish off tonight? Lone Wolf's a Christian atheist. I know that's not true. You're closer to a pantheist.
Closer to an absurdist pantheist.
Yeah. But you can actually get Christian atheists. What they're talking about there, traditional Christian traditionalists. Even Dawkins would say he's a Christian traditionalist.
Some people might just like the community. Some people might just like the messages that are being put out about being good to your neighbor, charity and all that. And some people, like you say, might just be traditional. It's part of their culture. So they just don't believe Jesus was resurrected or believe God exists.
Yeah. So you can actually have Christian atheists. It's like the cultural Jews. They don't necessarily believe a God exists, but they're fully involved in the culture and the practices and the traditions and all of that. Kimmo says, I was overjoyed to find out that Coming Tonight is an actual mineral. It's now my favorite rock. And yes, it actually is. That's why there were a number of memes about it. And Crisis says, and earlier tonight I mentioned being raised Christian. I just meant that is my past with it, but I don't consider myself one. I'd rather go by agnostic because I'm learning about whatever is around, so I don't know how to really choose yet. Good. The thing is, right, there is nothing wrong with being in a state where you go, I don't really know what to believe. I think that's a really good place to be in if you're the sort of person that's going to go, I want to look into it, right? At the end of the day, I don't need you to believe the same thing as me, right? I believe no gods exist. That's what I believe. I don't need you to believe that. You could turn around and in a couple of weeks say, do you know what? No, I think that the Hindu faith is the real one. Do you know what? That's cool. As long as it gives you peace and you do good with your belief, that's all that really matters as far as I'm concerned. So when you say you don't know how to really choose yet, what matters to you? What's important to you? I do have an article about why I believe no gods exist. Feel free to read it. But make sure, whilst you're reading that you look into the counters to the things I bring up as well. Because you might find the counters more convincing than what I say, or I link to the arguments in more detail. So I briefly mention a number of different types of problems of evil, basically. Look into the counters and look into the original arguments that I reference in short. And so on and so forth. Look into all the different sides. And that's what I would suggest is actually when you're in that position where you're agnostic, try and really weight things up. Look into all the arguments for and against all different types of gods. And consider there are very different types of entities that are referred to as gods. And consider, would you even think of them as gods? The classical theistic take on a god is very different to the polytheistic take on a god, which is very different to the pantheistic take on a god. And I think that you need to find out what you actually regard as a god in the first place to really answer the question if you believe a god exists or not.
Yeah, and as a doxastic involuntarist, I think your beliefs will make your choice for you the more you learn either side.
No,
you don't choose. Yeah.
We don't choose what we believe. No, you're right, Dave. At the end of the day, we get convinced one way or the other. But that's why I say look into the whole arguments on either side. And as Dave says, at one point you'll go, oh, this is what I believe about this topic. And if you want to have a chat with us, feel free. Like, we've got a Discord channel. The link should be on the YouTube page, so feel free to jump in there and have a conversation with us. You can get us on Twitter and Facebook and all of that. We've got a debate group on Facebook as well. But yeah, feel free to privately message us and we'll have a conversation with you. And I'll do my best to give you a real well-rounded opinion. But please appreciate that I do have a bias because I'm going to be more in tune with my own position. We all have biases at the end of the day, and as much as I will try and be even-handed, I will still have my bias there leading the way. That's the way we work. So yeah, so what you say there now, you say I'm also like, maybe a lot of things exist and we just have different names for them, and that's one of the things that happens. So one of the things about pantheism is it seems to be equating the universe or existence with being a god. Slightly, there's a number of different takes. There are some people that talk about energy as being god. There's so many different things, and that's what I'm saying. Find out what you actually think a god is or should be, and then you'll be able to find whether you think a god exists. So yeah, hopefully that'll help you out. Anyway. No, Command Cyborg. Yeah, he notices the plant moving behind Dave. Is it on its way around, or is it still there? No, I have noticed this, Dave. Your plant, right? It's doing some like really, really shifty stuff. I think it's like between your camera, it's making it look like it's moving when it's not, and then
Oh no, it's definitely moving. It's windy as fuck, and
right.
also it's a goddamn triffid hiding in plain sight.
So Cafe says pantheism is distinct. Panentheism is distinct from pantheism. There's also pandeism. Yes, you're right about panentheism being distinct from pantheism. So panentheism is essentially there is God, and within God there is the universe. Pantheism is God and the universe are one. I mean, these are really basic, simplistic definitions. And there's pandeism, which, as far as I'm concerned, between pandeism and pantheism, there's no real difference from what I've looked into. It just seems to be fair, pandeism seems a more accurate description than pantheism does. But I don't really see any difference between the two.
Oh, I just thought I do have one more question before we call it a night.
Oh yeah.
What is more likely for abiogenesis, God or
alien? This was brilliant. This was absolutely brilliant. We saw this earlier. It was the most ridiculous things, right? Yeah. So on Skeptic Generation, who are quite a well-respected channel, they asked that exact question, and it was a bit like, what do you think abiogenesis is? Like, dearie me.
I mean, maybe they misspelled and meant to put biogenesis. I'll give them that thing of, charity, but yeah, I mean, if they did mean that, it's, well, neither, because the answer is in the question.
Yeah. But there you go. But yeah, cool. So I think we'll leave it there for the night. I've had a very good time though, and it's been interesting approaching the old language games from another angle. It's quite encouraging to see that these are things that have been thought about for a lot longer than I've been alive. And there's still problems as well, which isn't as encouraging.
I mean, one of the things that Wittgenstein says in his thing is, like, a lot of people that discuss philosophy of language discuss how they think it ought to be, whereas he's taking a more sort of descriptive thing. But he says, if you really want to learn why he's right and you want to learn about all this stuff, all you have to do is look. Don't think about it. Just look. Yeah. And if you think about what I've said tonight and you start looking at conversations, you'll see how accurate he actually is and how there's all these things we've never really thought about and take for granted. But often discuss language in a very different kind of way, even though we're involved in the language game.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Command Cyborg says, I'm still sniggering about that question, Dave. Yes. You saw that earlier too then. And Crisis says, it's pretty wild. We're all just existing at the same time. I mean, within a certain theory of time, everyone has always existed at the same time as everyone else, and they're just experiencing it differently. But that's a really complicated theory of time.
As an empiricist, I just go with what I see, and what I see is now.
A theory rather than B theory.
But if you ask me about the Kalam, I'll go with B theory.
Because you want to win, right, Dave?
Exactly. I am an atheist and a skeptic, you know.
Awesome. Right. Well, thank you everybody who has watched this video tonight and is watching the rerun, especially all of you who've joined in the chat. You've made this absolutely fantastic. And Luke, you know what? As long as it's not pineapple, I really don't care.
Grilled baby.
But yeah, no, awesome. And you know what? Thursday we should have a stream, but we don't actually have a plan yet. We'll come to it. But Monday, right, is your next episode of Psyched, which is Bearded Heretic coming back, doing his first stream where Dave and I probably won't be winding him up the whole evening. So it might not be a 2-hour stream of us distracting him. It might only take him about half an hour to get through whatever he has to say. But folks, thank you very much for tonight. It's been absolutely fantastic. And before we go, I would like to say just one more thing. And that is, sorry, I'm looking for something. Make sure you check out the stream that we did on Severance because it's such a great show. I really, really, really want you guys to check it out. There's a lot of great philosophy in it. And honestly, it's one of the best things that we've watched. So please check that out and make sure you check us out. Sorry.
And we can watch it without worrying about spoilers.